Today we're tackling a practical guide. It's all about navigating containerized applications on AWS.
Right. And our main source is a 2023 A-Press ebook, Deploy Container Applications Using Kubernetes. We also looked at a review to get another perspective.
Exactly. And our mission, really, is simple. Figure out the actual value here.
Yeah.
For anyone wanting to get their hands dirty with Kubernetes on AWS.
Who's it for? What's inside? And why might it be useful for your learning journey? That's what we want to unpack.
Okay, so let's start with the audience. Who is this book really talking to? You might think Kubernetes means big companies, right? And the author does mention big names like Mercedes-Benz using it.
Yeah, but what's really interesting is this kind of dual focus. It nods to the enterprise, sure, but it explicitly targets IT students, sysadmins, system engineers.
Huh. So not just the giants.
Not at all. And that points to a bigger trend, I think. Kubernetes isn't just for Google or Amazon anymore. Things like AWS EKS, these managed services, and lighter versions like Micro K8s, they're making it way more accessible.
It's accessible to smaller teams, individuals even.
Exactly. Which is great for innovation, right? At all levels.
Makes sense. And the review suggested the book is very hands-on.
Totally. It sounds like it's structured like a practice manual, packed with code listings, screenshots of dashboards, annotations, tips.
Even homework assignments.
Yeah, homework too. It really leans into that practical side. The reviewer mentioned using Nginx and examples, then suggesting Apache for exercises.
Oh, right. So you're not just reading theory, you're actually doing things.
Precisely. Anchoring those abstract ideas in concrete tasks, that's super valuable when you're learning something complex like K8s.
And we should probably remember, this book isn't like standalone. It's part of a bigger series, right? 7th out of 10 A-Press books on AWS.
Good point. So while this one is practical, it fits into a potentially broader look at the whole AWS world.
But even in this hands-on book, it sounds like the author touches on some wider industry stuff.
He does, yeah. Despite the tech focus, it gets into some common IT headaches. Well, like the struggle companies have adopting newer software versions. It uses Java as an example, mentions dependency hell.
Dependency hell. We've all been there. You learn one thing, then boom, version 2.0 changes everything.
Right, and that whole mess is actually why things like containers and Kubernetes became so important in the first place. Helps manage that complexity.
And the author connects this to hiring practices, too.
Seems like it. There's a subtle critique, maybe, of how some places expect experience with the absolute bleeding edge, even when they themselves haven't adopted it yet.
Huh. Yeah, that sounds familiar. Companies taking years to update, but wanting new hires with day one experience on the latest thing.
It's a bit of a disconnect sometimes, a good reminder that what you're learning might actually be ahead of where many companies are in practice.
So, okay, how does the book ease people into Kubernetes itself? It can seem pretty daunting.
Well, their review suggests a gradual approach. Apparently, it starts super basic, like creating a static website on a plain old virtual machine.
Before even saying Kubernetes.
Seems so. Building that foundation first, then layering on the container stuff.
And then when Kubernetes does come up, how's it defined?
Pretty simply, a container management system. Explicitly not virtual machines, although... Well, the reviewer noted the book's examples often still reference VMs, maybe just as a practical setup for the exercises.
Could be. Using something familiar as a bridge.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Using a VM as the host environment to run the Kubernetes examples, perhaps. Anyway, it introduces container and Docker concepts first, then Chapter 5 really dives into Kubernetes proper.
Right, staged learning. And it mentions different kinds of Kubernetes, like Kubernetes Lite.
Yeah, K3s is mentioned, but the book focuses its examples on Micro K8s.
Why Micro K8 specifically?
It goes back to that target audience students, individual learners. Micro K8s is much lighter, self-contained, easier to run on your own laptop without needing a huge server farm.
Makes it more accessible for experimenting.
Exactly.
But it's not all point and click, is it? The review mentioned needing Linux skills.
Oh, absolutely. You definitely need some Linux command line chops to install and use Micro K8s. The book doesn't hide that. Kubernetes runs on Linux fundamentally.
Okay, so Linux basics are key. What tools does it introduce?
The main one is kubectl. That's the command line tool for talking to Kubernetes. And it apparently highlights just a few core commands to start: create, apply, delete, get, explain.
Manageable, not overwhelming.
Hopefully not. The idea seems to be to get you started without drowning you in options.
And for actually deploying apps, what concepts does it cover?
2 main YAML file types get introduced: deployment, and service.
Ah, the declarative approach.
Right. You write these files describing what you want, then use the kubectl apply command to make it happen in the cluster. Create your deployments, expose them with services.
And the reviewer saw a connection to object-oriented programming.
Yeah, an interesting analogy the book apparently makes. Could click for people with that background, you know?
Yeah.
Defining your objects, deployment, services, and then instantiating them.
Cool. Okay, moving past the basics, does it get into best practices? Core Kubernetes ideas?
It definitely hits on some key ones, like the one app per container rule, really important. Don't stuff multiple things in one container.
Yeah, that breaks the whole model. What else?
Replica sets. Explains how Kubernetes keeps multiple copies, replicas of your application running, so if one instance dies, others are there. High availability.
Like having backup dancers ready to step in.
Yeah, something like that. Keeps the show running. It also mentions RBAC.
Role-based access control? For security.
Exactly. Who gets to do what in the cluster? Pretty fundamental. And for container images,
Where to store them?
recommends public registries and specifically calls out AWS ECR, Elastic Container Registry, and Google's GCR.
And using ECR within AWS is probably smoother.
That's what the review implies. AWS has wizards and tools to make it easier to integrate.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to the AWS-specific service, EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service. How does that show up?
Quite a bit later in the book, actually. Chapter 13 out of 16.
Ah, so it builds up quite a bit before hitting the managed service.
Seems like it. It covers EKS, explaining it's AWS's managed offering built on standard Kubernetes, launched back in 2018.
And does it talk about managing access within AWS?
Big time. Focuses on IAM identity and access management for controlling who can use EKS, different accounts, user groups, all that. Crucial for security in the cloud.
And setting up EKS itself, is it presented as easy?
The review suggests AWS makes it pretty user-friendly, predefined options, assistance in the console to help create and configure clusters.
So less manual setup than running it yourself.
That's the whole point of a managed service, yeah.
Yeah.
The book also mentions the AWS CLI, the command line tool, has specific simplified commands for EKS too.
What about data? You know, stuff that needs to stick around even if containers come and go.
Good question. It introduces persistent volumes, PVs, and persistent volume claims, PVCs.
Kubernetes concepts for storage.
Right. And the corresponding deployment files you need, which you manage with kubectl, apply. It also mentions AWS EFS, Elastic File System, as a related storage option that plugs in.
Okay, and getting traffic into the cluster from the outside world.
That's covered too, the ingress object. It explains how that works to allow external access to your apps running inside Kubernetes.
So it covers the life cycle, deploying, storing data, exposing the app. Seems pretty comprehensive for a practical guide.
Yeah, seems to hit the key practical steps.
After finishing the book, where does the author suggest people go next to keep learning?
Recommends exploring more Kubernetes tools, reading developer blogs, learning from others' experiences. Standard stuff, but good advice.
And the reviewer had their own recommendation.
They did. Strongly recommended the official Kubernetes documentation at kubernetes.io, especially because, well, the reviewed book apparently lacks something important.
That's missing.
Architecture diagrams. The reviewer points out the book doesn't really show you the Kubernetes architecture visually.
Huh. That seems like a bit of an omission for understanding how it all works under the hood.
Yeah, I thought so too. The review said architecture mostly comes up early on, talking about Docker and containers, not Kubernetes itself.
So for that deeper architectural understanding, you really need to go to the official docs.
Seems like that's the takeaway. The official docs are excellent, by the way, very thorough.
Good to know. Okay, let's wrap up with a little context. The review included some background on Kubernetes itself.
Right, the origin story. Always interesting.
So the name.
Kubernetes, Greek for helmsman or steersman, guiding the ships or containers. And K8 is just shorthand K, 8 letters, S.
K8S. Got it. And it came from Google.
Yep. Google developed it internally based on their experience with Linux containers and released it open source in 2014.
Which explains the Linux knowledge requirement we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's built on that foundation. And 2024 marks its 10th anniversary.
Wow, 10 years. Feels like it took over the world much faster than that.
It certainly had a massive impact in a decade.
Okay, so let's boil it all down. What are the key takeaways on this A-Press book?
Well, in a nutshell, it seems like a really practical, very hands-on intro guide. Great if you want to actually deploy container apps with Kubernetes, specifically on AWS.
Best for individual learners, maybe. People who like code-heavy examples.
Yeah, that seems to be the sweet spot. It gets you started with micro K8s, basic commands, core deployment concepts. It touches on EKS later, but the initial focus is very much learn by doing with a simpler setup.
So for you listening, if you want that practical guide, lots of exercises, a way to start experimenting with K8s and AWS without needing a massive setup immediately, this sounds like a solid choice.
Definitely a viable option. Just keep in mind that focus on micro K8s early on and the lack of deep architectural diagrams, you'll want to supplement that elsewhere like the official docs.
Right. And that actually leads to a final thought for you to mull over.
Yeah, considering Kubernetes came from Google, built on Linux container tech, and now it's everywhere. How might getting a deeper grasp of that underlying Linux container technology actually empower you more?
You mean beyond just learning Kubernetes commands?
Exactly. Understanding the foundation beneath Kubernetes, beneath Docker, how could that knowledge help you navigate this whole cloud-native world no matter which specific tool or platform you end up using? Something to think about.